All right. Welcome, everyone. We are so happy to have you join us for today's virtual meeting hosted by NCSL's Post-Secondary Education Program. We want to provide all the information we can to assist you in your state policy decisions, in particular those that are right in front of you given the current situation. My name is Sunny Day. I am the program director for NCSL's post-secondary education team out of our Denver office. I'm very glad to kick off this first meeting of NCSL's higher education virtual meeting series addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we are going to talk about a key issue that is crucial to meeting all of your state post-secondary goals, and that is effectively addressing the inequities that regularly occur in today's higher education system and that are being exacerbated by the circumstances of the pandemic, potentially making it that much harder for already underserved students to complete their degrees. First, I'd like to walk through just a few housekeeping rules for today's virtual meeting. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to view on NCSL's YouTube channel within the week. For today's meeting, there is an option for you to virtually raise your hand or add a reaction to what you're hearing. Please do not share your screen. And finally, I encourage everyone, if you're able, to join by video. You can see the presentation that way, as well as the chat box, as well as your colleagues. So with that, let's get started. Let's all get our typing fingers ready, because before we start, we thought we would do a quick round of who's on the call via the chat box. So if you would, please enter what state you're from. If you'd like, we welcome you to voice a concern about inequity in higher education. And we also encourage you to guess which state capital is in this picture. So we will revisit this just in a few minutes here. Great, thanks everyone. I will mention that we had almost 60 legislators and legislative staff register for today's meeting. So I just want to acknowledge how much we appreciate you being here and that this really is a critical issue today. And so we're really excited to dig in. So let's do a quick look at the agenda for today's call. Again, this meeting is being recorded and we will upload links to the PowerPoint, to the materials, and to our YouTube channel where you can view the meeting again. And we encourage you to share our meeting resource page with colleagues and legislators and legislative staff who weren't able to join us today. Because if there are others in your office who would like to be invited to this series on post-secondary education that will continue through the rest of the year, we'd love to have you on our invite list and keep reaching out. So do let us know. Let's see. So I want to thank everyone for your entries in the chat box. We will make sure to address the issues that you typed in. And the answer to the important, very important question is, oh, I see someone at least has got it here. I don't know who got it first, but that is the stunning capital of my home state of Oregon. So good, thanks for playing. Great. So with that, let's go ahead and transition to today's conversation. I'm so glad to introduce our three speakers for this meeting, each of whom will spend some time providing their unique perspective on how states can tackle racial and economic disparities in higher education. First, we'll hear from Dr. Tiffany Jones, Senior Director of Higher Education Policy for the Education Trust, and a national expert on issues related to equity in higher education for low-income students and students of color. Dr. Jones recently published a set of recommendations for state policymakers related to equity in the pandemic, which you can take a closer look at using the link that's provided here. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Pacioni, who is currently serving as the Executive Director at the Colorado Department of Higher Education. In addition to her extensive experience with K-12 and higher education, an interesting fact about Dr. Pacioni is that she played basketball both at Stanford University and professionally. And I had the pleasure of working as legislative staff in the bill drafting department back when Dr. Pacioni was Representative Pacioni here in Colorado. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Representative Teresa Alonso Leon, who currently serves as chair of the House Interim Committee on Education and has previously served as the vice chair for the House Education Committee in the state of Oregon. Of note, Representative Alonso Leon is the first in her family to attend college and now holds a master's degree in public administration from Portland State University. Also of note, Representative Alonso Leon previously served as the high school equivalency and GED administrator for Oregon's Higher Education Coordinating Commission. So Representative Alonso Leon will talk with us about her legislation addressing cultural competency in higher education, and will share with us what she sees on the horizon. So again, welcome to all of you, and I'll turn it over first to Dr. Jones.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. Just excited to be a part of the conversation today. I'm going to talk briefly just about who today's students are, how they've been uniquely impacted by the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. I'll talk a little bit about what institutions and federal policymakers can do in response, but most importantly, what states can do to help support students at this time. So I look forward to the conversation, and I want to make sure everyone is awake on this Friday afternoon, so there will be just a little bit of interaction. All you have to do is use the chat function. So if you haven't yet figured out where the chat function is, at the bottom of your screen, I want to start off by, again, talking about who are today's students. So if you would give your best guess of what percentage of today's students are 25 or older. Just take a second and please just add your response to the chat box. If there's anyone brave to add what they would guess. Okay, I see some responses coming in. Awesome, awesome. So I've seen as low as 20 and as high as about 60%. About 40% of today's students are 25 or older. So again, unlike when maybe perhaps some folks were in school, or the type of college they went to, where I went to school, most students were coming to college right out of high school. When we think about the whole higher ed ecosystem, including all colleges and universities, 2-year and 4-year, about 40% of today's students are 25 or older. What percentage would you guess of today's students work in addition to going to school? And go ahead and add your responses to the chat box. Okay. So I'm seeing as low as about 50% all the way up to 88%. Okay, so folks think today's students are working. They are, more than half, in fact. So one statistic suggests that about 62% of today's students work. And then the last one I will ask are, what percentage would you guess of today's students are parents? You can go ahead and add your responses to the chat box. Okay. Janet says 35%. Let's see, I'm seeing 40%, 35%. Okay. All right, so just most of the estimates are just slightly higher than the answer. So about 28% of today's students are parents. It's also worth noting that many students fall into multiple categories. So they're working, they're over 25, and they're parents as well. And again, I just wanted to start here because it's important just to remember who these students are, and not sometimes the media we pay too much attention to in policy as well, that very kind of what has been described as a traditional student, but understanding that those norms no longer apply. If we talk about today's students, we're not talking about students necessarily that are going to college right out of high school, who are 18 years old, who go to school full time without a job. In fact, again, we must also in these conversations be inclusive and have a better sense of who today's students are. When it comes to equity as well, about 40% of students are low income. And so that's important to keep in mind as well, and approaching about half of students are students of color or non-white. Again, just to get a sense of the rich diversity of higher education and who students are. And so what's going on today? How are these students being impacted by the pandemic? What are the biggest challenges they're facing? Students today are facing emotional, financial, and academic challenges in this moment. I say emotional because this particular, health crisis means that more students are struggling with depression and grief. There's been some early surveys suggesting, comparing to where students reported this time last year, that students really are struggling much more and are in need of additional supports and resources. And unfortunately, because of course they're hopefully home safe, they may not have the same access they would if they were on campus in terms of access to counselors and resources to help them deal with grief. It's also worth noting that Black and Latino people are 3 times as likely to become infected and nearly twice as likely to die from COVID-19. And so that means that Black and Latino students in particular are, again, having to face the grief of perhaps having lost family members to this particular crisis. And again, perhaps without the same level of resources if higher ed was able to operate in its normal sense. But during this pandemic, it's been really challenging for these students. There's also the economic and financial impacts. Of course, many of you probably seen all the stories about, over 40 million people applying for unemployment. I think it's just worth noting always, though, the racial disparities that often exist there when we talk about unemployment rates being high. So while the country as a whole continues to struggle economically in this particular moment, just remembering that those unemployment rates are often higher for especially Black workers as well. And despite the assumed, increased need, this means, families have fewer resources to help them pay for college in this moment. It's unfortunate, but it's been reported about 250,000 fewer FAFSA renewals were submitted. And so again, that might suggest that there have been changes in plans related to students and families dealing with today's challenges, not necessarily that they no longer have financial need. And of course, the big concern is if those financial needs aren't met, that they may be unable to continue their education at this time. There's been multiple surveys, but one survey suggested that Black students in particular were more likely to be rethinking these college plans. And again, about 40% saying that they were planning to go to college in the fall, or it's too soon to say, compared to about 24% of white students. So that research suggests that there's a lot of students across the board that are really struggling to figure out what exactly their fall would look like, but that it has a disproportionate impact on students of color in particular. I just want to briefly talk about the academic challenges, of course, the things that are really in the purview of higher ed institutions. In this moment, as institutions are trying to figure out how to offer education safely, it requires that students have access to Wi-Fi and high-speed broadband internet and laptops. And also, again, the disparities persist, and this, again, there's research that suggests that students of color are more likely to rely on their cell phone as their primary means of accessing the internet, which might be okay for social media, but not so much for taking a course or writing out essays or completing their assignments. So again, it's important that as colleges are figuring out what to do to be able to offer educational opportunities at this time, we think about the challenges all students are facing, but how particular student groups might be impacted disproportionately. We already talked about, almost a third of students are parents. So if schools are closed or there's limited childcare options, that also means it impacts their ability to be able to focus on their studies as well. And again, all of this conversation helps set a context for what it is students need, what institutions may need to be able to support and meet these needs. So what I'd like to do now is just talk about kind of what can be done in this moment where there's so many challenges. Really quickly, I would just want to highlight that some of the ways in which I think institutions are getting it right and trying to be flexible at this time. Many are rethinking how they approach admissions, allowing classes to not penalize students for fail grades they had to take in the spring when there was so much disruption, rethinking their use and reliance on standardized test scores, Also, you know, some colleges have waived application fees and deposits, and it's really great to see this because again, this flexibility is in response to trying to meet student needs. The only thing I would just add here is it'd be really important for colleges to think about, even after we get through this COVID-19 crisis, how might these changes to making higher ed more accessible be important to sustain for the long term, so that higher ed isn't out of reach for so many students. Again, the federal government trying to provide some support to students and to institutions. I think the most important thing to note here is that the dollars to institutions matter. They're helpful, as well as the emergency aid that's been provided to students through the CARES Act. One of the biggest challenges, though, is that again, with the restrictions placed in terms of the implementation guidance provided by the Department of Education, so many limitations on being able to provide the emergency aid to some of the students who might need it the most, including undocumented students, including students impacted by the criminal justice system, including students who defaulted on a loan before, or even students who don't meet the standardized GPA requirements. And considering all of the chaos that have been the last 6 or 7 months, it's really important context, because now I want to just talk in detail about what it is states can do to make clear that there's a lot of groups of students that have kind of been left out of some of the federal efforts to provide emergency aid. And so there's still a lot more that needs to be done. First, what recommendation is states should coordinate with other state aid, should help higher ed institutions coordinate with other state agency to streamline access to any existing emergency aid and economic security programs, such as SNAP benefits or other affordable housing programs. Also, states should immediately suspend any student loan payments owed to the state. This is something that the federal government got right. Republicans and Democrats came together and decided in this moment of crisis, it's too much and students and families shouldn't be penalized for being expected to pay their student loans. This is something that states should follow suit and do as well. Also, third, states should consider canceling at least some part of state level student debt for those students who are most vulnerable during this time, particularly low income borrowers, perhaps students with some debt, no degree. And this is important because given the economic effects of what's happening right now, it can be very challenging to require payment from borrowers and families who already will be unable to make payments in many cases. The only thing states will be doing, honestly, is implementing punishments, and might be in some cases creating barriers to the economic recovery of some of the students and families in the state. This is a conversation that's happening at the federal level as well, in terms of if there's any sort of debt cancellation, what makes sense. And again, I just want to acknowledge the reality of the economic crisis, in that in most cases, states are figuring out how to keep the ship moving with fewer dollars. So I just want to acknowledge that and say what we're hoping for is just that low-income students, students of color, and the communities who are really struggling are prioritized as decisions are made about how to best use the limited resources. Also, again, our recommendation is that states are responding to any reduced budgets with equity in mind, and especially thinking about some of those groups who are not eligible for some of the support that's been made available at the federal level, such as, like I've mentioned, undocumented students as well. It's one other recommendation, states should also prioritize the needs of low-income students, and this means prioritizing need-based aid over other types of student financial aid. Many states have awesome need-based aid programs, and often students get turned away because there's just not enough dollars in the pot. And if states cannot fully fund all aid programs, which may be likely, the programs that should be reduced first are those that are quote unquote merit aid, that are, again, a lot of times rely on standardized test scores to determine who gets what. And too often that just results in students whose families can already afford college getting additional money to pay for college. And at this time, it would be important to make sure that need-based aid is prioritized, as those tough decisions have to be made. Also, states should allocate funds to kind of facilitate campus partnerships and shared resources where they can. Too often, the colleges serving the most low-income students or students of color have the fewest resources. And so that means if there's professional development provided to help faculty be more effective at teaching online, for example, what you don't want is the haves and have-nots, that the campuses that are wealthy, serving wealthier students, being able to afford such development. It's important that states and state agencies play a role in making some of these resources available to all of the professionals in the system so that all students are served well at this time. And wherever possible, of course, states should streamline any state aid application forms and processes and again, encourage financial aid administrators to consider large and sudden changes in earnings that might happen during this time of economic crisis. So I kind of went through those quickly because I wanted to stay within time. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, just want to acknowledge that it's a very tough time across the nation and know that states are facing a lot of challenges, having to do as much or more with less. And if anything, I hope any recommendations you made today provide some guidance on how to prioritize equity when making those tough decisions. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. You really set this conversation up today exactly as I had asked you to do. These issues are ongoing, but certainly are being exacerbated today. But so many of the issues that you talked about are things that legislators have been talking about for several years in terms of additional on-campus supports for students and on-campus mentoring and just a lot of the pieces that help students who are underserved progress and have good information. And so we hope to see also that those programs that are supported by evidence and best practices continue. So again, thank you very much for your introduction to this topic, and we will allow Dr. Pacioni to add the experiences that she has had here in Colorado. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Jones. That was wonderful and gives us the really the landscape of who are we working with and what are the things that we can do and what are the needs that are out there. And so in Colorado, of course, we have the new administration as of January of 19, Governor Jared Polis, and he had some very bold goals for the state of Colorado, and he's been delivering on that. And of course, each department of the state has been trying to deliver on the bold goals and the goals that he's given us. And two in particular for the Department of Higher Education. One has to do with affordability and to make sure that we are doing what's necessary to make sure that students have access, and not just access at affordability, but also that they are able to have the support services that are necessary to get them all the way to the finish line, which is that credential. And then the second bold goal, if you will, for higher education is that all of our students are prepared for the future of work, for the workplace. And so there's a lot of initiatives that we're doing on those two areas, both affordability and workforce preparation. In terms of our funding and how we are looking at affordability and what that means for the institutions of higher education and funding, we in Colorado back in 2014 passed some legislation that says for every 5 years we will revisit our funding allocation formula and make the adjustments necessary to make sure that we can keep our doors open, but also that we can look at cost containment and efficiencies and how do we make college more affordable. So we just passed last legislative session our 5-year review, so our new funding allocation model. And this one is very student-centered. It's really focused on how do we make sure that we are allocating funds for colleges that are doing right, if you will, by our students. And in this case, we're looking at 3 demographic groups of students in particular. So those are the underrepresented minority students, and in particular 3 groups, the African-American students, Hispanic students, and our Native American student populations. And so we're looking not just at all students of color, but these 3 demographic groups because they have performed in terms of educational equity and educational attainment. We have the largest gap in those 3 underrepresented minority groups. So the funding allocation formula will provide some incentives for colleges that are both admitting and graduating those students in particular. The second group are low-income students, so Pell eligibility is one of the factors that we're looking at. And so how well are our colleges enrolling and completing low-income students. And the third group are first-generation students. And so our first-gen students, of course, like many states, we have a large number of students who are first-gen, which to me is, you know, we've been working on this for so long. I'm still surprised at the number of first-gen students that we still have, considering, I mean, I was first-gen as well, and so, but you would think in the 100 years it's been since I went to college that we would have made even more progress. And so first-gen students also, colleges that enroll and complete. So there's a metric for enrolling these students, but there's also a metric for completing them, because it's one thing to just bring that diversity on your campus, but it's a second thing to really make sure that those students are successful and they earn that paper, they earn that credential. And so that's part of that funding formula. The formula, really, we try to make it so that it's not a competition between colleges to see who can enroll and complete the most, but it's within yourself. And so how many are you enrolling and completing as opposed to last year? So we want to make sure that the institutions are growing and competing against themselves and their metrics from the year before. We know that affordability is one of the biggest barriers to student success. And so this is one of the ways, if we can make sure that we are making it an incentive for colleges. And then also, as Dr. Jones said earlier, that we are providing the kind of need-based financial aid. In Colorado, in the past, we have been up to $200 million in financial aid. And because of the budget cuts, we are now, we had to cut that back to about $160 million in financial aid, but we are really trying to protect the need-based financial aid. So we have need-based work study, we have merit, and we have graduate need-based. And so we're going to continue to provide some graduate level need-based, because we know that all of the metrics and demographics around students of color who are entering graduate programs are disproportionately have fewer financial resources and financial aid. So we want to preserve that as well. So we're doing a good job, I think, on those areas when it comes to that formula. The formula will go into effect in the 21-22. And so this year, we're going to be really looking at all of those metrics and getting a good baseline, and so that we can see what the impact will be. But that will be a funding formula that will sit for the next 5 years, perhaps making a few tweaks to that. I wanted to talk about community colleges, because community colleges are often an entry place for those who are considering post-secondary options. In Colorado, and I have said this at every town hall meeting, I don't want it to sound trite, but I almost don't care what post-secondary option you choose, as long as you complete it. And that is the most important thing, because we know that those who complete, who actually earn that certificate, if it's a one-year program, or the associate, if it's associate's degree, if it's 2-year, or a bachelor's degree, it's the completion of those pathways that allow students to be successful. So choose whatever you want. If you want to go into the military, choose that as well. If you want to take a year of public service or humanitarian service, choose it, but complete, so that you build and develop the habits and disciplines of completing what you start. So for those students who want to start at the community college level, we are excited about that. We have many programs, and what we have worked on in Colorado is the transferability of those credits that are earned, so that students can have a line of sight to continue to a bachelor's degree. In Colorado this year, the community college system just released a new program that's called Bridge to the Bachelor's Degree. And so in this case, if a student wants to enroll in this particular program, then with the academic counseling that they will receive on both ends, both the 4-year institution and the 2-year, they will be able to have a seamless transition from the 2-year institution to the 4-year institution. And that was inspired by the work of Ames Community College and the University of Northern Colorado. They were the first to do that in the state of Colorado. And it's called Ames to UNC, very creative. But now all of the community colleges are partnering with their local 4-year institution so that students can have that seamless transition. Of course, as we know, community colleges are less expensive than a 4-year residential institution. And so students can make it more affordable, especially if they're Pell eligible. They could actually, the Pell 6,200 roughly will cover the tuition for your community college. So this is a way to increase affordability and access both. So we're excited about that program to get underway. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about our undocumented students. And Colorado, I don't know if we lead the nation, but we certainly have a very long-standing commitment to our undocumented students. And we were one among the first states to ensure that DACA students would have access to institutions of higher education at the in-state tuition level. And then recently, last legislative session, we also enabled those students to have access to in-state financial aid. So it's one thing to have the in-state pricing of tuition, but you still can't really afford that if you're not eligible for some financial aid. And so now those students are eligible for in-state financial aid as well. So we're excited about that. And with all of the, what was happening in DC and talking about for the CARES Act and who was eligible, we have engaged all of the institutions of higher ed to write letters to our congressional delegation to just say how much we as a state, how much we support our DACA students. And we have what we're called asset students, and that's advancing students for a stronger economy tomorrow. And these are students who are permanent residents, US citizens, and students without lawful status. So that they are able to receive that in-state tuition as well. So we have been, and this Governor Polis is very strong in his work in supporting our DACA students. So, and we also support our international students. So when there was this movement to say that international students, if colleges went all remote, that they would have to be deported, we also stood up to that. We have roughly 12,000 international students who attend our colleges and universities. And so we do the best that we can to fight to protect the students that we have. We want all students to be welcome to Colorado and to higher ed in Colorado. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about tackling the racial and economic disparities. We, as Dr. Jones mentioned, there are so many ways that, that when this COVID crisis hit, that the inequities were exacerbated. One of those had to do with access to hardware, if you will, to laptops, to the equipment that was necessary. So proud of my department, we stood up right away. We stood up a campaign called No Lapse in Learning. And that was an opportunity to solicit donations and to get laptops that we could refurbish, that we would be able to give to those students in need of laptops and hotspots. And we had many of our colleges, like most of the states, we had, some of the parking lots in some of the colleges became hotspots where students could access Wi-Fi in the parking lot of the institution. And so we did the best that we could to try to to level the playing field a little bit. We still had some serious issues around broadband in our rural communities. And of course, Colorado has very large rural communities. So we have been trying to make some systemic changes in higher ed to make sure that all students, especially low-income students, have access and that they see our state as a leading state to really care for our students, both students of color, low-income students, first-gen students, that we prioritize making sure that they have equal access, if you will, to institutions of higher ed. We are trying to tackle a very severe equity gap in Colorado. We are one of the leading states in terms of total adult population with credentials. We're at 58%, and we're second to Massachusetts. We're not considering Washington, D.C., because they're not really a state, but Washington, D.C., of course, has the most credentials, but it's mostly imported, and many of ours are imported as well. So when we have that number at 58%, we know that break down that number, 64% of white students or white adults aged 25 to 34 have a credential, but only 30% of Hispanic or Latinx students adults have a credential. That's a huge gap, and even bigger gap when you consider what the market is demanding. In Colorado, our industries say that 75% of adults need to have a credential. So they're asking for 75. We're at about 58, 59%. White adults 25 to 34 are at 64%. Hispanic are at about 30%, Native American is about 30%, and African American is about 40%. So it's huge, huge, huge gap in terms of our attainment. So we are really focused on that. We have just launched our second cohort of Equity Champions Coalition to help elevate and raise up what is it that we're going to do. We have the numbers, we know what's necessary. We've been on kind of listening tours, if you will. We convene students of color to hear what they see as the disparities. And now it's really time that we move into more and more action to address these inequities. We're looking forward, I'm looking forward to hearing from the representative to hear about her legislation, because we may be copying that here in Colorado. But all of our institutions recognize this as a major goal for the state, and we are trying to put all of the pieces in place to make sure that we are actually moving and having not just incremental growth over time. To me, that's not enough. We have to have really an inflection point. And so we are looking at all of the ways that we can address this. And one of the key ways is making sure that we keep our colleges affordable even during this time. Most of our institutions have frozen their tuition for this year, but still it's still not enough. So we're looking at all of the ways and the creative ways and innovative ways that other states have addressed this issue. And then we will be happy to copy all of the best practices so that we can make those changes that are necessary. Want to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think I'm a little bit early, but I hope that's okay. I will say one thing. We have a special program that's called COSI, which is the Colorado Opportunity Scholarship Initiative. This is a very dedicated focus on the students of color, low-income students, and first-gen students. And it's really a combination of private and public partnership. So the state has allocated about $7 million to COSI to distribute, but it distributes in two ways: scholarships, direct scholarships to students, those students in those categories, but also allocation to community partnerships that provide the wraparound services. So our COSI scholars, if you will, these students who are receiving scholarships, they have shown a 89% retention rate from first year to second year, which is huge. 89% is amazing. When you add not only the scholarship, but the wraparound services from our community partners, that number goes up to 94%. So 94% of students of color, low-income students, first-gen students who are receiving both the scholarship from COSI and the wraparound services from the community partners, those students, 94% of them persist from first year to second year. So those numbers are off the chart, and we love that program, and we're trying our best to protect and preserve that program in the midst of all of these budget cuts. And so far, the legislature has done so. I think we only lost $1 million, but still, we still are able to provide those supports for our students. So we know pretty much what works. We just have to be committed, and that's really the political will and really almost the social and moral will to provide the right resources that are necessary to have all students succeed. And that's our goal, is to make sure that all students have access, it's affordable, we have the services necessary, and if you add that plus that plus that, then you equal success. We are also tackling what we call the social determinants of student success. So hunger insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation insecurity, even mental health issues, that we're trying to tackle all of those and do what's necessary to ensure that our students can succeed and get that paper, get that credential, get that degree. So I'll stop there. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you and to hear your comments and your questions. I look forward to the next part of this, this presentation. So thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Dr. Pacioni. You know, as someone who lives here in Colorado and has a couple of people coming up through the system, I'm tremendously grateful for your leadership, and all of these things are visual, and we here in the state really feel the commitment. So, and just all of the things that you mentioned, you know, I see direct evidence of here in Colorado. So again, thank you so much. Great, great. Let's go ahead and turn now to Representative Alonso Leon. Really pleased to have you here, and thanks so much. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And you're on mute.
Okay, here we go. I'm still not used to that. Thank you, Sunny. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you, Dr. Pacioni and Dr. Jones, for your great presentations and really setting the stage and the things that we need to hear to really better prepare students and help ensure our institutions are doing everything they can to help our students. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you all for tuning in today's conversation on how the COVID-19 pandemic has elevated and shed more light on the inequities in post-secondary education. My name is Teresa Alonso Leon, State Representative for House District 22, which for those of you who are familiar with Oregon, covers Woodburn through the north part of Salem. In addition, I serve as the first Indigenous Latina chair of the Oregon House Committee on Education. As someone who has valued, prioritized, and worked in education for the majority of my life, I feel strongly for today's conversation and appreciate the energy and the efforts behind trying to work together to help our students nationwide. While COVID-19 has exacerbated, as many have mentioned, and shed light on the inequities among students of color, these inequities were already existing and negatively impacting our students' abilities to achieve success in post-secondary education. In 2017, to help address this, I introduced House Bill 2864, the Cultural Competency Standards and Fluency for Higher Education, which charges Oregon public universities and community colleges to create a cultural competency standards for their institution and employees by the end of 2020. So this December 2020 coming up, which has led them to do a self-analysis of the work in this area. The journey to this point has been very long and very personal to me. To provide a brief history of this bill, it should be known that House Bill 2864 was started many years ago before I became a legislator. It started in 2012 by a small committee consisting of school staff, faculty, administrators, and students who had observed numerous longstanding incompetencies at Oregon universities regarding cultural differences and the needs of minority students in post-secondary institutions of education. House Bill 2864 was a legacy bill that former State Representative Gallegos started. I was honored to have gotten to continue this work. I am certain that former Representative Joe Gallegos and everyone who worked on this project is elated to see how far this bill has come and to know that it has gained national attention. Cultural competency in Oregon universities is important because for too long, we have failed our students of color. For Black and Native Oregonians, university completion rates are below 50% and are on the decline. It is absolutely unacceptable that over half of these students enroll in university but are unable to graduate within the 4 years, if they graduate at all. While Latina, Latinx youth are completing university education at a higher rate, their Black and Native peers they are still falling short of their white peers. Though this may not be the sole cause of low completion rates for minority students, we have heard so many stories from students of color over the years who have mentioned an unwelcoming environment or lack of cultural competence support from professors or advisors that just upset me when I heard them. This is something that I experienced firsthand being a first-generation college student and having worked in higher education institutions. There has been a sharp increase in hate-driven incidents against students of color in Oregon. And when I gave my floor speech during my freshman term as a representative, Oregon was among the top in the nation for complaints according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. I've heard so many gut-wrenching stories from young students during committee meetings. The first was a student reporting that faculty members have used the word illegals to describe Mexicans, bringing fear to immigrants and our DACA recipients in the university. Another story mentioned many instances of staff members making casual comments that are rooted in century of oppression. as well as one administrator dismissing the need for gender-neutral restrooms, neglecting our transgender students' basic needs for safety. It was painful to hear these stories from our future generation leaders. These instances have been happening and continue to happen way too many times, especially in a state that has been progressive on so many issues, but yet we're haunted by our own past. As I briefly stated earlier, House Bill 2864 requires our public universities and community colleges by the end of 2020 to create a cultural competency standards for the institution and their employees. These standards must include continuing training opportunities for faculty, staff, and administrators, as well as institution-wide goals on creating an inclusive environment. House Bill 2864 defines cultural competency to mean the process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, languages, economic statuses, races, ethnic backgrounds, disabilities, religions, genders, gender identifications, sexual orientation, veteran status, and other characteristics in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of and preserves the dignity of individuals, families, and communities. The bill directs each institution to establish their own process for creating cultural competency, standards, and goals. This process will include a broad range of perspectives and give equal weight to suggestions from administrators, faculty, staff, and students. This gives students a voice in the process of creating standards, as well as getting them to get buy-in to these efforts made to create a more inclusive environment. Our goal with this legislation was not to create specific standards or practices for our institutions of higher education, but to create a framework to follow so that each of our individual institutions can create a set of standards tailored to the needs of their students, faculty, staff, and administrators. We've come to find appropriate language to allow flexibility in the process for creating these standards, while addressing the concerns of students that feel that current standards, trainings, and inclusion efforts do not go far enough to create a healthy learning environment. The purpose of this bill is to supplement the work that is already being done and provide a framework and direction for these efforts. Schools that already have standards can use this as an opportunity to reflect on their progress and make updates that are needed. Institutions with inclusion training and programs, but no overarching standards and goals, can use this as an opportunity to evaluate their program and find places to improve. Even though we've had a large coalition of allies, both in the legislature and outside, the process passing House Bill 2864 was unfortunately not as easy as we wanted it to be. To ensure we had buy-in from all partners, I met individually with college presidents, students, and partners in our Oregon Student Association. Our conversations focused on setting up the correct structure for this process that would work for all universities and community colleges. This included conversations around how this fit in with what institutions were already doing to make sure that it was not too burdensome, but push them to move forward. Understanding differences in institutions and levels of equity work, House Bill 2864 allows each institution to build an individual process for compliance. It is not a one-size-fits-all model and has been crafted to be flexible for each institution to build something that fits within their campus culture. The universities and community colleges will report on progress to their governing boards, not the state legislature. The governing boards of each institution is under no obligation to adopt the recommendation that comes out of each institution's individual process, meaning that they maintain their independence autonomy. House Bill 2864 simply provides a framework and directs universities and community colleges to spend time considering an important issue on their campuses. While the bill passed out of committee with unanimous support, the House floor debate was not. With House Bill 2864 being passed during my first year, this bill was one of the first bills I worked on with a multiple-hour debate. Among the concerns from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle centered around fear that this bill would infringe on freedom of speech, diversity of thoughts, and an overall punishment on higher education institutions who weren't meeting equity goals. At the end of the 2.5-hour debate, the final vote in the House Representatives was 45 in favor and 15 against, and 28 in favor and 1 against on the Senate side. My goal with this legislation is to have this be a starting point, creating a space where conversations can be had in our institutions to create inclusive spaces for all. When institutions present this plan on December 2020, this will allow legislators and partners an insight on what needs to be accomplished to address these inequities. While COVID-19 has exacerbated issues for students and faculty alike, we are in a unique situation where we can transform our higher education institutions to a student-centered, student-ready model that fits the needs of Oregon's unique and diverse student population. While the process of passing this bill was difficult, this bill is simple. It requires our institutions to reflect on their current campus climate and create goals for themselves to improve. I believe that we should be promoting a learning environment where every student feels valued and respected, regardless of their background. And that is what this bill does. It promotes inclusion and a healthy learning environment. It is not punitive, it does not infringe on diversity of thought, but rather gives campuses the tools to make sure that diversity is celebrated. I'm excited to see all the energy and in the conversations here in the next part of this presentation. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing in Oregon, and look forward to any questions that you all have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Alonso Leon. It's really a privilege to be able to have these conversations with you all and learn about how you're tackling these issues in your states. So again, thank you, thank you. Something that was asked early on and a couple of you have addressed is a specific concern related to technology for students. And I guess I'm thinking now sort of forward thinking, should this continue into the future? Is that still a big concern? And would each of you want to just take a minute and comment on sort of one or two things that you're kind of keeping your eye on going forward, and or related to the technology? I know that that's a really big question. So do it in 20 seconds. No, I'm just teasing. I'm happy to really open this up. It's great to see other people's faces too. So I welcome comments. Maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Pacioni, on like, do you feel you've solved the technology issue for students, or does that continue to be a struggle?
So thank you for that question, and it's really important. It's a really important question because without access to the kind of technology that's necessary, if and when we have to go back to remote, we then put those students back into a position where they are not able to fully engage with the learning process. And so we have a greater need in our K-12 institutions and our K-12 student population than we do it at the college level. Many of our colleges already had distributed the resources that they had, and then we came along with our no lapse in learning to supplement what was necessary to make sure that students have. We recognize that we may have to revive that campaign if we go back to remote, because I'm sure that we did not hit every single student that had need, but we certainly we were able to give away about 700 laptops, which was a great way to address it, but there is still great need, especially in families where there are multiple students. And so you have multiple access points. We are working, our other parts of the state are working to expand broadband access. And so we can't stop those efforts just because we think we're bringing everyone back to a campus. So we've got to continue the push to make sure that there's access for everyone.
And let me ask if there are any others who just want to unmute themselves and make a comment or say hello while we have everyone on the phone here.
I'll just add a little bit to what Dr. Pacioni said. This is a serious issue. We have, we understand that in areas where we do have broadband, our young people may still not be able to afford it. We have families who are low income who, even if there are internet access, they still can't afford it. So that's an issue that we are looking at to help solve. Everybody's right. Not everybody has technology, the tools to be able to go online and do the work. And then I worry a lot about our rural students. In the places where we don't have broadband. Oregon is definitely looking into increasing broadband around the state, but we know that that's a structural issue that we're working on long term. But in the short term, we know that that's something that we need to try to figure out with our students. Some of our K-12 students are providing hard copy packets for our students to do work, but but that's not necessarily enough. The other issue around technology that I think is important to note is if we're asking parents to help their children do work, in some cases that's a far-fetched request when parents who are essential workers are not available at home to help their children. They're out doing that work to feed their children, and or don't know how to navigate technology. So there's a lot of issues, real issues that we need to try to not try but problem solve to ensure that all of our students have the best education they can have moving forward under COVID circumstances.
A quick shout out to our providers, because in Colorado, all our technology providers, in terms of internet providers, they did 90 days of free access to families and students. And so that was remarkable. And so even for those students who they didn't have the ability to pay for those, they at least had some free access for those 3 months. So shout out to them. That was a good help to come alongside.
I'll just add, this conversation is an example of something we're going to be paying attention to, which is what's the impact of all of this going to be on the colleges that were already under-resourced, who are more likely to have the students that have already been discussed, who might have limited access to this particular technology. And just for example, the last recession, we saw in too many cases where sometimes states wanted to be fair and equal, but and say, okay, 30% cuts across the board, but that has a disproportionate impact because certain colleges have been underfunded over time and they're serving more students who are going to be in greater crisis right now. And the technology is an example of the additional needs they're going to have to survive through this moment. And so what we're paying attention to is both how the decisions that states are making about how to construct those budgets are going to impact those institutions. And the same thing is true at the federal level as well. We're paying a lot of attention to how additional stimulus money will be dispersed, and will it be targeted to those institutions that need it the most. And most importantly, will there be a fix for this national problem around broadband access that impacts, like they said, P20 education opportunities at this time. And so we think there's a role for Congress to play there as well.
I see another question here, and happy to pose that question. Also want to acknowledge that we are 1 minute to 2, and I think there are a couple of folks who need to hop off. I don't know. I will just continue very briefly and just ask Dr. Pacioni, what does enrollment look like for fall? Are there many students deciding to take a gap year? Do we know that's affecting students of color more than others?
Yeah, I was just about to type in one, so thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak to it. Yes, we are seeing that at our community colleges, it's maybe 25 to 30% drop off in enrollment, and our four-year institutions. Now remember, community colleges, you can show up on day one, so we're hoping that students will, but our four-year institutions, of course, they have to enroll prior, and so we're seeing that same kind of a decline, which is precipitous. What I have been saying is, I'm not sure that this is the best year to do a gap year, because I'm a big fan of gap years if you're able to do something with it. If you're doing a humanitarian year abroad, or you're doing something, but there's not a lot of jobs to be had for students who are trying to take a gap year, and there's not a lot of service to be done. Yes, we still have some AmeriCorps things that you can do in the city. City Year is still up and running, but it's not the year to sit home and do nothing. So if possible, do an online course or take one class, or you have to keep the momentum going in your education, because what we have learned, and I think Dr. Jones mentioned it, the staggering number of adults who have some college but no degree. And one of the reasons is because they stop out. And if you stop out now before you even get started, or if you stop out, the chances of you going back start to get slim to none. So my feeling is do something, continue your education, even if it's just a little bit.
That's a good tip. And that reminds me, that we've been hearing so much about student debt, and it's the students who don't complete who are burdened the most by student debt. And even the same populations of students, we see the same burdens exacerbated for those students when it comes to student debt, which is something that legislators have been taking a lot of action on in a variety of ways around the states. So we will make sure that we continue to inform legislators about that. We have quite a bit of information about that particular issue. But we're also going to make sure, I just want to assure everyone on the phone that we collect all the information that was gathered today. We did provide links to some of the legislation. You should be able to just, Google some of the programs that we were talking about. There's robust information out there. But please then also look to our meetings resource page, because we will actually provide links to this information. We will keep you updated on the other upcoming meetings that we have, which we're really excited about. So please, to all of you who joined us today, commit to coming to these other meetings, and we'll just have a really interesting and important conversation for the rest of this year as the situation changes. It could not be more dynamic right now. I also wanted to, just before I let you go, remind you that we have a post-secondary legislation database at NCSL that's new to us this year, where we are tracking quite literally every single piece of state legislation in every state that is being introduced, considered, pending, failed, in 40 different categories. And so I welcome you all to peruse that tool. It's really telling and interesting. You can tackle it from a variety of ways. You can look at what's happening around equity and cultural competency, or you can look at what's happening in Arizona or Oregon. So that's a really neat tool. And then in terms of the meetings that are here in front of you, I just want to remind everyone this is the first of 6 we have planned for the rest of this year. And again, the information will all be available on that meeting link at the bottom. So we will post archived video of this meeting, links to the PowerPoints, any additional information we can put together about what our wonderful speakers shared today. And so coming up next month on August 21st at the same time, we will be taking a look at the role of community colleges during this pandemic and how they can be positioned to help state and local economies bounce back. So please share these invites widely. All legislators, staff, NCSL Foundation members and partners are welcome to participate. If you have any questions, just reach out to us. We will make sure to follow up on all of the good action that's happening in the chat box and follow up with folks. And I just want to say again, thank you to my power panel. This was just really fantastic. Just so much good information today. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.